November 18th, 1942. Southwestern outskirts of Stalingrad. The cold was brutal that morning, the frost stiff on rifles and the breath of soldiers crystallizing in the air. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Himmler, commanding a company of the German Sixth Army, squinted through the bleak horizon where smoke still curled from gutted factories. Artillery fire echoed in the distance, a grim reminder that urban combat had turned Stalingrad into a landscape of rubble and despair. Yet, for Himmler and his men, hope still clung to the familiar rhythm of military hierarchy and orders from high command. Friedrich Paulus, general of the Sixth Army, paced the command tent with measured steps, mats spread across a wooden table. He traced the positions of Soviet forces with his finger, noting concentrations along the Don River and along the northern approaches. His staff officers, young lieutenants and adjutants, whispered in low tones, calculating supply estimates, the distance to the railway lines, and the remaining reserves of food, fuel, and ammunition. Each calculation brought a subtle tension to the room, though few dared to voice it aloud. Reports indicate increased Soviet movements near Kalach, Hauptmann-Weber said, glancing at the map. Recon patrols report unusual activity in the forests, and along the river crossings we might expect a flanking maneuver. Paulus nodded, but did not reveal the growing anxiety in his own mind. Ensure the defensive positions are reinforced. No gaps in the lines. Every unit must hold, regardless of the enemy's movements. Outside the command post, the city itself groaned under constant bombardment. German soldiers patrolled streets littered with abandoned furniture, burned-out trucks, and the silent corpses of civilians caught in the crossfire. The air smelled of cordite, smoke, and frozen earth. Every step carried the risk of sniper fire or sudden artillery barrage. Young conscripts from the 14th Panzer Division trudged alongside seasoned veterans, their faces pale under frostbitten cheeks. For most soldiers, November had brought a sense of grim perseverance rather than dread. Stalingrad had been a symbol of victory, a prize the Wehrmacht would take at all costs. Yet, subtle signs hinted at an impending catastrophe. Supply trains had become irregular, and the Luftwaffe had promised more airdrops than they could realistically deliver. Fuel trucks were delayed by Soviet ambushes, and rations were increasingly meager. Sergeant Otto Fischer adjusted the strap of his Caravana 98, glancing toward the horizon where smoke rose in columns. "I swear, the Russians are everywhere these days," he muttered to his comrade. "Keep your mouth shut," replied Geoffrey to Karl Meyer, his fingers numb around his weapon. "We still have orders, we hold, that's all we can do." Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's air supply planes made their rounds. Ju-52 transports, laden with ammunition and rations, descended from the grey sky, dropping the cargo near the front lines. Many of the supplies were damaged on impact, lost to mud, snow, or miscalculation. Pilots reported heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire and increasingly aggressive interceptors. Each flight was a gamble, and each missed drop further strained the already beleaguered Sixth Army. The morning wore on, and reconnaissance reports confirmed the chilling pattern. Soviet forces were massing in strength north and south of Stalingrad, creating a pincer movement that threatened the German positions along the Don. Orders trickled down cautiously, emphasizing defense without acknowledging the looming risk of encirclement. Soldiers continued their patrols, menacing city ruins with the practiced rhythm of those who knew they were being watched, both by the enemy and by fate itself. By mid-afternoon, reports reached Paulus that Soviet forces had cut off smaller units along the flanks. Radio communications crackled with urgent messages from encircled detachments. Heavy artillery cut off no relief hold. The words were fragmented, desperate, carrying a tension that no officer could ignore. Paulus exhaled slowly, masking the cold sweat forming at the nape of his neck. He scanned the map again, eyes narrowing on the converging Soviet divisions. Operation Uranus was underway, though the full scope of the encirclement had yet to reach him in complete clarity. He understood that the Sixth Army, despite its size and armor, could be trapped. Yet, he remained outwardly calm, issuing orders as though victory was still within reach. The city groaned under artillery fire, smoke and ash cutting over frozen streets. Soldiers huddled in trenches and rubble, clutching weapons, unsure of the danger approaching from behind their defensive lines. For the first time, a quiet fear began to seep through the ranks, a sense that they were no longer masters of their fate, that the icy winds of November carried a portent of doom. In the evenings, as darkness settled, Paulus held briefings with his senior officers. The Soviets had seized key points along the flanks, cutting railway lines and isolating forward positions. Reports of Luftwaffe supply failures trickled in. Confidence among the men began to waver. Yet, orders from Hitler, transmitted with his characteristic inflexibility, demanded no withdrawal. The city was to be held at all costs. The 6th Army soldiers braced themselves against the coming storm, unaware that within days the noose would tighten and the vast forces of the Red Army would leave them trapped, starving, and freezing. November 19th, 1942. Northern Don River Sector. The first light of dawn revealed an unsettling sight for the German forward observers. Columns of Soviet tanks and infantry advancing in coordinated rhythm, their tracks cutting through frozen terrain toward the flanks of the 6th Army. Sergeant Otto Fischer and his squad crushed in shallow trenches, the earth beneath them hardened and cracked by frost. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he peered over the lip of his foxhole, clutching his carbine in 98. "By God, they're everywhere," muttered Fischer. Jeffrey de Kalmai glanced toward the distant horizon. "It's like the whole damn country marching on us." In the command tent, General Paulus reviewed the latest intelligence. Soviet pincer movements had gained unexpected speed. Divisions under Generals Rokossovsky and Vasilevsky converged from the north and south, aiming to encircle the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. Maps showed that supply lines connecting Polish forward divisions to the main Wehrmacht positions along the Don were being severed systematically. Each line cut meant less food, less ammunition, fewer reinforcements. Hauptmann Weber reported urgently, "Herr General, units in the north report heavy engagement. The enemy is bypassing fortified positions, threatening the rear. Our flank guards are being overrun. Communications are breaking down." Paulus' face remained impassive, but his mind calculated the implications. The Luftwaffe's promised supply support was limited, dependent on aircraft that risked anti-aircraft fire and harsh winter conditions. Even if planes could deliver the promised rations and ammunition, the amounts were inadequate to sustain the Army's size. To reinforce the northern sector, Paulus said quietly, "No gaps, hold, every man counts." Yet, outside the command posts, the city streets were already beginning to reflect chaos. Small detachments of the 6th Army fought desperately to delay the Soviet advance, but exhaustion and lack of supplies were beginning to sap morale. Machine gun crews ran low on ammunition, artillery units faced frozen barrels and inadequate shells, and medical units struggled with frostbite and injury cases piling up faster than they could treat. As evening fell, the Soviets tightened the encirclement. Tanks rumbled along snow-choked roads, infantry advanced through forested sectors, and partisan units disrupted German rear communications. The southern pincer had made particularly rapid gains, capturing key villages along the Cher River and isolating forward German units from the main supply hubs. In one isolated command post, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt received a fragmented radio message from his northern outpost. Enemy forces advancing, units surrounded, ammunition critical, retreat impossible. The static-laden transmission ended abruptly. Reinhardt's hand shook as he crumpled the message. He understood the meaning. The 6th Army was being cut off completely. Paulus convened his senior officers that evening. Candlelight flickered across their drawn faces as he traced the encirclement on the map. "The enemy has executed a coordinated pincer," he said. "The northern and southern sectors are collapsing inward. Relief may not be possible. Our orders remain. Hold Stalingrad. Do not attempt to withdraw without explicit instructions." Yet even as he spoke, a deep unease pervaded the room. Many officers understood the grim reality, even if Hitler's directives forbade acknowledgement. Starvation, exposure, and relentless Soviet assaults loomed ahead. The 6th Army, once a symbol of Wehrmacht might, was fast becoming a trapped force hemmed in by terrain, weather, and the vast Red Army. Outside, in the ruins of Stalingrad, soldiers huddled against freezing winds. Fires smoldered in improvised pits, providing scant warmth. Men scavenged for bread, potato rations, or the occasional canned meat. Frostbite and hunger began claiming bodies silently, adding to the physical and psychological toll. Yet orders demanded resistance at all costs. The night brought a strange stillness over the encircled army. Artillery fire crackled intermittently, shadows shifted across the ruined streets, and the soldiers of the 6th Army, once confident in their invincibility, began to feel the tightening news of the Soviet pincer. The realization that escape was slipping further out of reach began to creep into whispered conversations and private reflections. For Paulus, the decision was agonizing. Retreat was forbidden, yet his men were being strangled by circumstance. Winter had arrived in full force, and the promise of Luftwaffe resupply appeared increasingly unrealistic. The encirclement was almost complete. Within hours, the fate of the 6th Army would no longer be theoretical. And yet, the men at the front, frozen, exhausted, and hungry, continued their patrols and skirmishes. Discipline held them together, but a quiet terror had begun to replace the initial confidence of conquest. The 6th Army, a machine of war, was slowly realizing that they were trapped inside the ruins of a city that had become a tomb of their own making. November 21st, 1942. Western Stalingrad, near Mamayev-Kurgan. The frozen wind cut through layers of German uniforms, whistling across the rubble-strewn streets and shattered factories. In terror for Air France, Huber crouched in the remnants of a bombed-out apartment, his rifle gripped tightly, eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. Frost had begun to bite at his fingers, and hunger gnawed at his stomach, yet he remained vigilant. Across the street, a fellow soldier struggled to light a small fire from scavenged wood, the smoke barely rising in the icy air. Reports from the front continued to filter in, fragmented and often contradictory. Radio operators relayed messages of Soviet troops seizing key positions along the Don and the Chur rivers, cutting off German supply and retreat routes. For the men on the ground, it was no longer abstract intelligence, it was a slow, inexorable pressure closing around them. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Guderian, S. Adjutant, dispatched to assess supply capabilities, returned to Paulus headquarters in the evening. Herr General, we cannot maintain lines to the encircled sectors. The Soviets have complete control of the flanks. The ammunition and rations are already running critically low. Paulus listened silently, his fingers tracing the contours of the map. The cold commandant smelled of wet wool, kerosene lamps, and fear, though he did not show it. He had anticipated challenges, even setbacks, but the speed and effectiveness of the Soviet pincer were faster than expected. Each day, each hour, increased the pressure on his army, stripping away options and hope. The Luftwaffe will supply what it can, Paulus said finally, his voice firm, masking the tension beneath. We hold, that is our order, that is our duty. Outside, the soldiers felt the bite of reality. Frostbite had claimed the extremities of many men, and rationing meant that hunger had become constant. Corporal Wilhelm Kjager huddled near a makeshift stove, gnawing on half a loaf of black bread. How long can we hold like this? He whispered to a comrade, voice trembling. The first deaths from exposure were recorded in small field notes, officers marking names and units with a detached efficiency. Yet each name carried with a reminder that the call was not a minor inconvenience, but a slow executioner, just as lethal as Soviet artillery or snipers. At the front, soldiers faced another reality. Morale was fraying. Units once coordinated and disciplined were now fragmented, communications delayed or broken entirely. Young conscripts froze in fear, while veterans moved with mechanical precision, holding their lines through sheer habit and determination. Skirmishes became desperate attempts to delay the inevitable rather than achieve victory. In the command tent, Paulus convened a council with his senior staff. Maps were spread across tables, piles of messages scattered in disarray. The northern and southern pockets are isolated, relief is uncertain, supplies will not arrive in sufficient quantities, we must plan for prolonged defense under these conditions. Major Erich von Manstein, present in the liaison capacity from Army Group Don, spoke quietly but firmly. We must anticipate the worst. Encirclement is nearly complete. Break up may be the only option, though Hitler will never approve. Paulus nodded, acknowledging the grim reality without allowing despair to show. Orders continued to be issued: hold positions, maintain discipline, conserve ammunition, and prepare for Soviet assaults. Yet behind the stoicism of command, the men understood that their situation was rapidly deteriorating. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe attempted to bridge the widening gap with supply flights. Juncker's Ju-52 aircraft descended over the encircled areas, dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Many of the drops were lost, crates smashed on frozen terrain, supplies consumed by snow, or intercepted by Soviet units. Pilots reported heavy anti-aircraft fire and poor visibility. Each sortie risked lives and rarely delivered enough to sustain the army. On the streets of Stalingrad, soldiers scavenged, rationed, and huddled in the ruins of buildings that had once been homes or factories. The city's landscape had become a frozen graveyard, littered with debris, corpses, and the remnants of the Sixth Army's once mighty machinery. Each day brought the knowledge that food, fuel, and ammunition were dwindling. By nightfall, a quiet panic had begun to ripple through the encircled forces. The men understood that escape was no longer an option. The Soviets had effectively cut off all lines of retreat. The realization spread in hushed conversations, fleeting glances, and the silent fear in frozen eyes. They were trapped. The Sixth Army, encircled, isolated, and slowly starving, began to comprehend the magnitude of its predicament. Frostbitten, exhausted, and increasingly desperate, the soldiers of Stalingrad settled in for another night in the ruins of a city that had become both their battlefield and their tomb. The reality of encirclement had arrived in full force, and with it, the chilling understanding survival depended on endurance, resourcefulness, and the fragile hope that relief might come, a hope that dwindled with every passing day. November 26, 1942. Eastern Stalingrad, near the Red October factory. The morning air was bitter, slicing through layers of wool and leather. Jeffrey Takal Maya huddled against a steel beam, nibbling at a half loaf of bread so dry it scraped the roof of his mouth. His stomach growled incessantly, a reminder that the promised Luftwaffe airdrops were insufficient, inconsistent, and often lost to the snow and mud. Around him, men whispered, their voices low and hoarse, recounting tales of comrades succumbing to hunger or frostbite. The ruins of Stalingrad had become a frozen graveyard. Tanks lay abandoned, burned out, factories south under layers of ice, and streets were littered with debris, both human and mechanical. Soldiers scavenged desperately for food, chewing on anything edible, roots, frozen potatoes, scraps of horse meat supplied in previous rations. Discipline remained intact in pockets, but desperation eroded morale at every turn. At headquarters, General Paulus received another report from his supply officers. Head General, the Luftwaffe has flown 3 sorties in the last 24 hours, each delivered less than 10% of our daily requirements. Men are going hungry. Ammunition is critically low in the northern sectors. Paulus' jaw tightened. We will make do, issue rations carefully, prioritize frontline units. We hold Stalingrad. We hold the city. Hauptmann frowned, glancing at the list of units awaiting supplies. Sir, at this rate, we will be reduced to half strength within a week. Starvation and exposure are already claiming more lives than Soviet fire. Paulus nodded stiffly, his face a mask of determination and anxiety. He had long been aware of the limitations of the Luftwaffe's air supply efforts, yet Hitler's orders were unequivocal: Stalingrad must be held at all costs. Retreat was forbidden, and the thought of surrender was unthinkable to the High Command. Across the city, soldiers endured a daily grind of frozen streets, intermittent Soviet artillery barrages, and the ever-present spectre of hunger. Sergeant Franz Huber, once robust and confident, now moved sluggishly, his hands shaking from frostbite and malnutrition. We can keep going like this, he muttered to a fellow soldier while scavenging for rations scraps near a ruined bakery. The psychological toll was equally severe. Soldiers whispered about the encirclement, about comrades who had gone days without food, and about the futility of endless resistance. Private Heinrich Schills clutched his stomach, shivering violently. How much longer can we last? How much longer? At night, fires flickered in improvised pits, illuminating the gaunt faces of men who had begun to look more like shadows than soldiers. Sleep was fitful and brief, punctuated by the distant roar of artillery and the crunch of snow under approaching boots. Morale, once buoyed by faith in leadership and training, eroded with every passing day of deprivation. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened their grip. Patrols intercepted small German units attempting to scavenge for supplies beyond the encirclement. Mortar pounded weakened positions, and tanks slowly advanced along frozen avenues, heading in any hub of breakout. The Red Army, disciplined and well-fed, exploited the harsh winter to compound the suffering of the encircled Wehrmacht. In the command tent, Paulus convened his officers for a grim assessment. Rations will be further reduced. Only critical units will receive ammunition and food. We must maintain defensive positions despite the lack of supplies. Every man counts. Hold Stalingrad. Major Erich von Manstein, still present as liaison, leaned forward. The Luftwaffe cannot sustain this army. Even if every plane were to drop supplies successfully, it would not be enough. You are running out of time, Head General. Paulus exhaled slowly, masking the internal conflict roiling within him. Orders demanded resilience, but reality gnawed at every corner of the Sixth Army. Hunger, frost, and relentless Soviet pressure were now greater threats than artillery or snipers. On the streets, men began to improvise. Horses from supplied units were slaughtered for meat, frozen rations were boiled into thin gruel, and clothing was scavenged from the dead to stave off frostbite. Corpses were left where they fell, the bitter cold preserving them like grotesque monuments to the inevitability of decay and suffering. Despite the horrors, pockets of discipline persisted. Machine gun crews held positions, artillery units fired intermittently to keep Soviet forces at bay, and soldiers patrolled streets with rigid routine. Yet the shadow of starvation loomed over every action, turning even the bravest men into fragile, desperate figures struggling to survive. The realization began to crystallize slowly, but unmistakably. Stalingrad was no longer a battle to be won. It had become a trap, a frozen cage where the Sixth Army was slowly suffocating under its own constraints and the relentless squeeze of the Red Army. The days of confident, aggressive maneuvers were over. Now, survival itself had become the only measurable objective. December 1st, 1942. Over the skies of Stalingrad. The sun rose dimly through a haze of smoke and frozen mists, illuminating the battered city below. Oberleutnant Hans-J. Meyer, a Ju-52 transport pilot, gripped the controls of his aircraft as he flew over the encircled Sixth Army. The wind screamed past the cockpit, and his breath fogged the glass as he adjusted altitude to avoid both Soviet flak and the treacherous gusts of the Russian winter. Below, the once proud formations of tanks and trucks were buried under snow or abandoned entirely, their crews weakened by hunger and frostbite. Mayer-S cargo, a precarious mix of ammunition, medical supplies, and meager rations was the lifeline promised by the Luftwaffe. Yet he knew the stark reality: the supplies could barely meet even a fraction of the Sixth Army's daily needs. Drop zones were perilous, often miscalculated due to shifting front lines, and the ever-present threat of anti-aircraft fire made each sortie a near-suicidal endeavour. "Brace yourself," whispered his co-pilot as ground fire erupted, sending tracer streaks across the sky. The plane shuddered under the impact, ice forming along wing edges. "We need to reach the drop zone intact." Below, the encircled troops spotted the aircraft with a mix of anticipation and despair. Corporal Wilhelm Kjaer shielded his eyes against the sun's reflection off the snow, calculating the plane's trajectory. Each Ju-52 represented hope, but each flight also brought the potential for disappointment. Too often, supplies were lost or destroyed on impact, captured by Soviet patrols, or dropped too far from their units to be recovered. Inside Paulus' command tent, staff officers grimly reviewed reports. Only 20% of daily rations delivered, Hauptmann-Weber reported. Units in the north report critical ammunition shortages. Casualties from frostbite and malnutrition continue to rise. Paulus listened, his face a mask of professional composure. Internally, he understood the growing desperation. Hitler's orders were clear: Stalingrad must hold. Yet the promise of an air supply lifeline was proving inadequate against the scale of the encirclement and the harshness of the Russian winter. Even as Mayer approached the first drop zone, the consequences of failure became clear. Crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies were released from the plane, but many smashed upon impact with frozen earth or snow-covered debris. Soldiers scrambled to retrieve what they could, often losing valuable minutes under enemy fire. One miscalculated drop meant lives lost to hunger or frostbite that could not be reversed. Inside the city, Private Heimatschulz and his comrades clawed through snow to recover what little rations had survived the drop. Each handful of hard bread and morsel of canned meat was a lifeline. Yet the totals were meager, barely enough to sustain energy for the continuous patrols, defensive actions, and labor required to maintain trenches, barricades, and frozen positions. Over the next days, sorties continued with mixed results. Luftwaffe pilots risked their lives repeatedly, yet the weather worsened. Snowstorms reduced visibility, winds carried supplies off target, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire increased as the Red Army recognized the critical value of these flights. The promise of sustenance remained only partially fulfilled, feeding the illusion of hope while slowly eroding morale. Back in the command tent, Paulus convened another council. Major von Manstein, still acting as liaison, leaned forward with a grim expression. "Even if every sortie was successful, Head General, the volume of supplies is insufficient. Starvation and exposure will continue to claim more men than Soviet artillery." Paulus' voice was combat firm. "We do what we can. Orders remain: hold Stalingrad. Every man holds his ground. Every position count." Outside, soldiers scavenged desperately. Frostbite was rampant, limbs blackened, toes and fingers lost to the cold. Corpses littered the streets and frozen fields, often unburied due to a lack of manpower. Those who remained fit moved with grim determination, but the invisible enemy, the cold, hunger, and exhaustion, claimed more lives than bullets or shells. The failures of the Luftwaffe to deliver a consistent and sufficient supply chain were becoming painfully obvious. The Sixth Army, isolated and encircled, was facing not only a formidable Soviet army but also the slow attrition of starvation and exposure. Morale faltered quietly, discipline remained tenuous, and each day brought a mounting awareness: survival was slipping beyond reach. As December deepened, Stalingrad became a frozen mausoleum. Ju-52s flew overhead with diminishing returns, each aircraft a symbol of hope and impending frustration. Soldiers on the ground counted each crate, ration, and round of ammunition, knowing full well that the Luftwaffe could not possibly sustain them. Within the encircled lines, the realization began to crystallize: the promised lifeline had failed, and the Sixth Army was slowly, inexorably, being strangled into submission. December 10th, 1942. Stalingrad, the ruined industrial district. The bitter Russian winter had descended fully. Temperatures plummeted well below zero, frosting every exposed surface and seeping through the inadequate winter gear issued to the German Sixth Army. Corporal Wilhelm Kjaer's breath formed clouds in the icy air as he huddled in a trench next to a smouldering fire, trying to stave off frostbite in his fingers and toes. Each day brought a cruel repetition: hunger, exhaustion, and the gnawing awareness that the enemy was closing in from all sides. The city itself had become a frozen graveyard. Streets that were once avenues of military advance now lay filled with rubble, abandoned tanks, and the bodies of both soldiers and civilians. Snow covered the corpses like a thin, silent shroud. Huber, a seasoned non-commissioned officer, moved between trenches, helping the wounded as best he could. Yet there were far too many to tend to, and the bitter cold turned medical treatment into a near impossibility. Reports from the front lines painted a grim picture. Units were cut off from one another, surrounded by Soviet forces in a tightening noose. Communication lines were fraying under constant artillery fire and sabotage. Radios failed intermittently due to battery depletion and moisture. Every soldier felt the crushing weight of isolation, cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and any realistic hope of escape. In his command post, General Paulus reviewed the latest intelligence with a growing sense of dread. The northern and southern pincers had closed almost entirely. Estimates suggested that over 250,000 men were encircled within Stalingrad, with limited rations and freezing temperatures threatening to devastate the fighting capability of the army. Paulus' orders remained the same: hold the city at all costs. Yet internally, he was acutely aware of the impossible situation. "Sir," Hauptmann Weber said, voice low, "the men are weak, frostbite and hunger are claiming more lives than the enemy, morale is faltering. We cannot sustain this for long without relief." Paulus' gaze remained fixed on the map. "We hold, that is our duty. Our honor depends upon it. Every man must understand. Stalingrad cannot fall." Meanwhile, on the ground, the human toll was apparent. Young soldiers shivered in improvised shelters, rationing their meager portions. Some gnawed on frozen horse meat or scavenged what little food they could find. The cold was relentless, and every day more men succumbed to exposure. Desperation crept into the ranks, a quiet, insidious companion to fear. Private Heinrich Schulz, who had been patrolling the northern sector, returned to his squad with frostbitten hands and feet. "I saw 5 men dead in the snow froze before they could even cry for help," he whispered, his voice trembling. Around him, his comrades nodded silently, each recognizing the same grim reality. The Sixth Army was slowly dying from within, long before any Soviet bullets struck them. The Luftwaffe continued its efforts, but worsening weather grounded planes for days at a time. When aircraft did reach the encircled forces, the drops were often inaccurate, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or scattered too far from the intended units. The soldiers on the ground, desperate and exhausted, scrambled to salvage what they could. Many returned empty-handed, their stomachs gnawing with the relentless pangs of starvation. Night in Stalingrad brought no comfort. Fires smoldered weakly, offering little warmth against the frigid air. Soldiers slept in turns, sharing scraps of clothing and blankets, huddling together for survival. The constant threat of Soviet artillery and sniper fire combined with the physical strain of cold and hunger created a pervasive sense of doom. By mid-December, the reality of encirclement was undeniable. The Sixth Army was isolated, trapped by geography, winter, and Soviet strategy. Supplies were insufficient, reinforcements impossible, and every day the army's strength diminished. Soldiers understood it implicitly, in every frozen limb, in every gnawing pan of hunger, in every distant echo of artillery shells. And yet, orders remained: hold Stalingrad. For now, the men continued to obey, driven by duty, fear, and the faint hope that some miracle might still arrive. But with each passing day, the bitter cold and isolation tightened its grip, slowly crushing the woolen body of an army that once seemed invincible. January 10th, 1943. Stalingrad, the central district. The Sixth Army had been encircled for nearly 2 months. Snow draped the ruined city like a suffocating blanket, freezing corpses where they fell and masking the devastation beneath that cold, sterile white. The once proud Wehrmacht, the symbol of Hitler's unstoppable advance, had been reduced to a collection of desperate men shivering in trenches, abandoned factories, and makeshift bunkers. General Friedrich Paulus paced his command post, maps sprawled across tables, pencils scratching calculations that were increasingly irrelevant. Reports from the front were fragmentary, isolated units running out of ammunition, soldiers succumbing to frostbite, and ration levels that no longer allowed men to fight effectively. Each message chipped away at the illusion that the Sixth Army could hold indefinitely. Major Erich von Manstein, still acting as liaison, leaned over Paulus' shoulder. "The northern and southern pockets are completely isolated. Our forces cannot break through to relieve you. The Luftwaffe cannot deliver the supplies you need. Every day the army weakens further. Hey, General, you know the truth." Paulus exhaled slowly, masking the fear and frustration that gnawed at him. Hitler's orders were clear: no surrender, hold at all costs. Yet he could see the impossible reality reflected in the frostbitten, hollow-eyed soldiers moving through the streets below. Starvation and cold were claiming more lives than the Soviet artillery. On the front lines, soldiers moved like shadows of their former selves. On terror as he affronts Hubert and his squad huddled in their ruined warehouse, rationing their remaining bread. "We can go on like this," muttered Private Heinrich Scholl's teeth chattering. "We all die before the Soviets even reach us." Hubert's gaze swept over the battered men around him, each gaunt face illuminated by the weak flicker of a makeshift fire. "We hold," he said quietly, "because that's what we retrained to do, because surrender is unthinkable." Yet even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Survival was slipping through their fingers, and Stalingrad had become a frozen tomb. The Luftwaffe's efforts continued, but each sortie delivered only a fraction of the necessary rations and ammunition. Supply planes were intercepted, shot down, or miscalculated, scattering their precious cargo into the snow. Soldiers scrambled to retrieve what little they could, but it was never enough. By mid-January, hunger and frostbite were the primary enemies, and the Soviet forces had only to maintain their encirclement to claim victory. Paulus received another grim report. Units in the north have fewer than 300 rounds per company. Medical services are overwhelmed. Frostbite and starvation casualties outnumber combat casualties. He traced the positions of his army on the map, noting how completely the Red Army had closed the ring. There was no escape, no viable relief, and no possibility of replenishing supplies adequately. That evening, in a quiet tent lit by a single flickering lamp, Paulus convened his senior staff. The words were hushed, deliberate, as he acknowledged the truth without defiance. "We are encircled. Relief is impossible. The army is weakened. Every day we remain here, more men will die." The discussion turned to the unthinkable surrender. Hitler's orders forbade it, yet the evidence was undeniable. Starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion had reduced the fighting capability of the army to a fraction of its original strength. Men could no longer move artillery, carry supplies, or mount effective defenses. Surrender was not a choice, it was the only path to save the remaining lives of those still alive. By January 31st, Paulus had no illusions left. Reports indicated the Sixth Army's effective strength had fallen dramatically, tens of thousands incapacitated by cold and hunger, ammunition critically low, and morale shattered. Soldiers were moving sluggishly, many simply lying in snow-filled trenches, too weak to continue. The Soviet encirclement had achieved its goal. The Germans were trapped, starved, and frozen, their fate sealed. Outside the command posts, the city lay silent under the heavy snow. The ruined buildings whispered with a cold wind, as if mourning the collapse of an army that had once been feared across Europe. Soldiers huddled in small groups, conserving warmth and strength, while artillery fire from the Soviets punctuated the eerie stillness. Paulus, faced with the stark reality of his army's condition, made the fateful decision. He drafted orders for surrender, ensuring the remaining men would be spared unnecessary death. It was a moment of profound tragedy. A proud, disciplined force brought low, not by the heroism of their enemy, but by encirclement, starvation, and the merciless Russian winter. In the early hours of February 2nd, 1943, the Sixth Army's surrender began. Lines of exhausted, frostbitten soldiers filed out of their positions, hands raised in submission. Officers followed, their pride intact but their army broken. The Red Army, well-fed and disciplined, took the survivors into captivity. Stalingrad had become a testament to human endurance, suffering, and the brutal calculus of war. The Sixth Army, once a symbol of German military might, had realized the devastating truth inside Stalingrad. Trapped, isolated, and weakened by cold and hunger, they were doomed. The city, frozen and scarred, bore witness to the ultimate price of overreach, underestimation, and the relentless pressures of war. February 3rd, 1943. Prisoner collection point Stalingrad. The air was bitter, thick with smoke from smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of unburied bodies. The surviving soldiers of the Sixth Army shuffled through snow-choked streets, many barely able to walk. Frostbite had claimed toes and fingers, hunger gnawed at stomachs hollow from weeks without sufficient rations, and exhaustion had dulled both senses and morale. These were men who had survived artillery barrages, sniper fire, and the brutal combat of urban warfare, only to find the most insidious enemies were cold and deprivation. Sergeant Franz Huber moved slowly among the lines of prisoners, his face expressionless but ice-haunted. Around him, former comrades whispered their disbelief, recounting the horrors they had endured. Days without food, nights spent in frozen trenches, and the slow deaths of men too weak to continue. Some cried openly, others stared blankly into the distance, numbed by shock. At a nearby collection point, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Himmler observed the process of surrender with a heavy heart. The Soviets were methodical, registering each man, confiscating weapons, and providing minimal warmth or food. "We are fortunate to survive," he muttered quietly, though the words felt hollow in the freezing wind. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had once been part of a disciplined, confident fighting force now understood the full impact of encirclement. Starvation, frostbite, and the knowledge of an inevitable captivity had left many incapable of thought beyond survival. Some men wandered aimlessly through the snow, while others huddled together, seeking warmth and the faint comfort of human presence. News reached Paulus, now a prisoner himself, that of the roughly 250,000 men encircled, only a fraction would survive the initial months of captivity. The harsh winter, combined with inadequate Soviet logistics and disease, meant that many would succumb long after surrendering. Even as he contemplated the magnitude of the loss, Paulus maintained a composed demeanor, understanding the historical significance of what had transpired. Stalingrad had not merely been a defeat, it had become a symbol of overreach, hubris, and the unforgiving reality of total war. For the Red Army, the surrender was both victory and validation. Years of planning, intelligence gathering, and relentless pressure had culminated in the complete encirclement of a formidable opponent. Soviet officers recorded the numbers meticulously, weapons seized, equipment captured, and prisoners taken. The logistical effort of transporting and feeding such a large number of survivors presented challenges, yet the triumph outweighed the burdens. Among the German survivors, stories of endurance and courage circulated quickly. Corporal Wilhelm K. Jur recalled his nights in freezing trenches, scavenging for meager rations, and defending positions with dwindling ammunition. Sergeant Huber recounted how small acts of initiative, bravery, and solidarity allowed units to hold their lines despite near impossible conditions. These stories would later become the basis of both military studies and personal memoirs, illustrating the human capacity for resilience even in the most hopeless circumstances. Meanwhile, the devastated city of Stalingrad bore witness to the immense human cost. Factories lay in ruins, streets were filled with rubble and snow-covered corpses, and the landscape itself seemed to mourn. The battle had taken not only military lives but civilian ones, leaving the city scarred for generations. Yet, for the survivors of the Sixth Army, Stalingrad would forever be remembered as a place where their invincibility was stripped away, leaving only endurance, suffering, and the bitter lessons of overreach and miscalculation. By mid-February, the last pockets of German resistance were gone. The Red Army had secured complete control, and the surviving members of the Sixth Army were being marched toward camps in harsh conditions. Hunger, cold, and disease would claim thousands in the months ahead, turning Stalingrad into both a battlefield and a crucible of human suffering. The surrender had far-reaching consequences beyond immediate loss. Hitler's insistence on holding the city at all costs had resulted in the destruction of an entire army, leaving a strategic vacuum on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces gained momentum. Morale surged, and the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. Historians would later mark Stalingrad as a turning point, the moment when the tide of the war shifted irreversibly. For the individual soldiers who survived, the lessons were stark and unforgettable, the limits of endurance, the consequences of strategic hubris, and the brutal reality that even the most disciplined forces could be undone by encirclement, winter, and deprivation. Each man carried the memory of frozen comrades, the gnawing hunger that consumed their resolve, and the heavy weight of knowing that Stalingrad had claimed far more than land, it had claimed the spirit of the Sixth Army itself. February 15th, 1943. German High Command, Army Group South. The news of Stalingrad's fall travels solely through the channels of the Wehrmacht. In Berlin, Hitler received word of the complete destruction of the Sixth Army with a mixture of disbelief and rage. Orders had been clear, the city was not to be abandoned. Yet, the operational reality had rendered those orders impossible. The encirclement, executed flawlessly by Soviet forces during Operation Uranus, had trapped 250,000 men in a frozen coffin. In the conference room of Army Group South, generals gathered around a long table, maps strewn across its surface. General Erich von Manstein, recently relieved of direct command at Stalingrad, outlined the situation with clinical precision. The Sixth Army has been annihilated as an effective fighting force. Our forces on the Eastern Front face significant gaps in the southern sector. Soviet momentum will continue unless we reorganize and reinforce. Admiral Karl Dienitz, present as an observer, noted the long-term implications. This is more than a tactical defeat. The loss of Sixth Army, along with their equipment and morale, shifts the balance on the Eastern Front. Reinforcements will be needed, but time is against us. The Soviets have demonstrated operational superiority, coordination, and endurance. Within the Wehrmacht, the fall of Stalingrad shattered the illusion of invincibility. Officers and soldiers alike grappled with the psychological impact. Once believed notions of German military supremacy were replaced with caution, fear, and an acute awareness of vulnerability. Memoirs from survivors later revealed a pervasive sense of disbelief, how a single operation, skillfully executed by the Soviets, could trap and destroy an entire army. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was more than a victory, it was a defining moment in the war. Operation Uranus had not only encircled the Sixth Army but had demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic planning, mobility, and coordination. Soviet morale soared, while propaganda emphasized the humiliation of the Wehrmacht, galvanizing both soldiers and civilians alike. The implications of the surrender rippled across subsequent campaigns. German forces on the Eastern Front were forced to adopt defensive strategies, divert resources, and postpone planned offensives. Meanwhile, Soviet forces exploited their momentum, pushing westward with renewed vigor and confidence. The loss of an entire army at Stalingrad marked a strategic turning point. The Wehrmacht, previously dominant, was now on the defensive. At Stalingrad itself, the survivors of the Sixth Army were collected into POW camps, their physical condition dire. Many had lost fingers or toes to frostbite, countless others bore the scars of malnutrition and disease. Each man carried the weight of the city's destruction and the memory of comrades who had perished in the snow-filled streets. These survivors, though prisoners, became living testimony to the costs of strategic miscalculation and the brutality of encirclement warfare. Historians later analyzed the battle as a combination of errors and underestimations: Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs, Paulus' adherence to impossible orders, the inadequacy of Luftwaffe supply operations, and the sheer skill and persistence of Soviet command. Yet beyond the tactical and strategic lessons lay the human story: tens of thousands of men trapped, isolated, and slowly consumed by cold, hunger, and despair. By mid-February, the Red Army had secured the city, repaired what infrastructure remained, and begun consolidating control. Meanwhile, the German High Command faced the sobering reality that Stalingrad would not only be remembered for its tactical brilliance but as the site of one of the most devastating military defeats in modern history. The destruction of the Sixth Army served as a stark warning: even the most disciplined, well-equipped forces could be undone when encircled, undersupplied, and subjected to the brutal realities of winter warfare. As the snow continued to blanket the city, the legacy of Stalingrad took hold, a symbol of suffering, endurance, and the turning tide of the war. For the soldiers who had survived, the lessons were indelible, etched into flesh and memory. And for the world, the fall of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of a profound shift in the trajectory of World War II, a turning point whose impact would echo across the Eastern Front and beyond. March 1st, 1943. Stalingrad and the Eastern Front. The city lay silent under a thick winter blanket, the ruins of factories, apartments, and streets frozen in time. Where the Sixth Army had once maneuvered, only the footprints of soldiers both living and dead remained, a stark testament to the scale of the human cost. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was now more than a battlefield. It was a monument to sacrifice, endurance, and the triumph of strategy and coordination over brute force. The surviving German soldiers, malnourished and frostbitten, were being transported to POW camps hundreds of miles away. For many, the journey was as brutal as the battle itself. Disease, cold, and exhaustion claimed more lives en route than had fallen to bullets during this siege. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich M. Müller, reflecting on the collapse of the Sixth Army, wrote in his journal, "We were trained to fight, to endure, to conquer. Yet here, in the snow, stripped of supplies and hope, we were powerless. Stalingrad did not fall because of Soviet fire alone, but because we were trapped by our own circumstances and command." Back in Germany, the military and civilian population were grappling with the enormity of the loss. Propaganda could not disguise the strategic and psychological shock. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility was shattered, and Hitler's insistence on unconditional defense had resulted in the annihilation of an entire army. Families of the fallen and captured faced months of uncertainty and grief, while the High Command reassessed strategies across the Eastern Front. Historians and military analysts later distilled critical lessons from the catastrophe. Encirclement, when executed with speed and coordination, could annihilate even the most formidable forces. Logistical planning was as vital as tactical skill, and the human cost of overconfidence in strategic decision-making could be devastating. Stalingrad became a case study in the consequences of rigid command, underestimation of the enemy, and the unforgiving nature of winter warfare. For the survivors, memory became both curse and sustenance. Memories of comrades frozen or starved, spent shivering in trenches, and desperate scavenging for meager rations were indelible. Yet, amid suffering, stories of bravery and small acts of resilience emerged. Soldiers who risked life to deliver water to a wounded comrade, officers who improvised defenses, and men who shared their last scraps of food formed a tapestry of human endurance in a frozen, shattered city. The Soviet perspective emphasized victory and propaganda, highlighting the skill of commanders like Generals Rokossovsky and Vasilevsky, and the discipline and coordination of the Red Army. Yet even the victors recognized the enormous sacrifice required. Stalingrad had claimed hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives as well, a reminder that no triumph came without cost. Stalingrad's legacy extended beyond the immediate military and political consequences. The city became a symbol of the human cost of war, a reminder that strategy, hubris, and environment could combine to create tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The Sixth Army's destruction served as both a warning and a lesson. No force, regardless of training, equipment, or confidence, was immune to the consequences of encirclement, isolation, and the harsh realities of winter combat. By spring 1943, as snow melted from the streets and ruins of Stalingrad, the surviving soldiers were already dispersed across distant Soviet camps, carrying with them the indelible mark of encirclement, starvation, and loss. Historians would later recount their stories, the tactical brilliance of the Red Army, and the rigid adherence to orders that had sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. Stalingrad had forever altered the trajectory of World War II, and its lessons would be studied by military strategists for decades to come. The Sixth Army had realized the devastating truth too late. Encircled, cut off, and weakened by cold and deprivation, their fate was sealed inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Yet from that disaster emerged profound understanding of strategy, resilience, human endurance, and the unforgiving consequences of hubris. The echoes of Stalingrad would resonate across history, a chilling reminder that even the strongest can fall when trapped by circumstance and the relentless forces of war.